Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of Rethinking Progress on growth, ecology, planetary limits. Many of you are familiar with this initiative, but I'm going to say a couple of words as well as something about who you have in front of you. I'm Eliana Ferrara. I'm a professor of public policy here at HKS and program chair of the MPAD program. And with me are Rebecca Henderson and Lucie White, whom I will introduce in a minute. The people in the audience, this is an open event, but many of the faces I see, I recognize as the key core members of the Rethinking Progress group. So let me say what this is. This is a year-long discussion-based program that we started this year, and it brings together Harvard students and faculty with the idea of trying to investigate, interrogate, and question the way we define and we measure progress. We have decided to structure the discussion into 5 themes. The first was the foundation of economics, and we had a very productive session back in the fall term on this with Professors Slaveson and Maskin. Today's topic, ecology and planetary limits, is another key part of our curriculum. And then innovation and technology, democratic erosion and inequality. And we will conclude with rethinking the economic paradigm. And for each theme, what we've tried to do is to get together in small groups, do some reading, some discussion, and then have a public event which is like today's event. So this has been possible thanks to a number of people whom I would like to thank. The first is the Dean's, it's not just one person, more than one, it's the Dean's office, because this initiative was selected as one of those that the Dean's office decided to sponsor. And then most importantly is my co-organizer, Surbi Barajwa, who is sitting there. And those of you who are part of it receive many, many emails from Surbi, and the others should know that she's really been a driving force behind this. And then Sebastian Garcia is also my right hand in research, but happens to have a taste for these types of discussions. And Christine Zuba, who has the key quality of disappearing every time I want to thank her. And in fact, she's not around, but she's my faculty assistant and has been helping a lot. So let me get to the more interesting part now, which is just giving you a background of the 2 amazing scholars that we're lucky to have with us today. Let me start from Professor Rebecca Henderson. She's the John and Natty McArthur University professor at Harvard. She's based at Harvard Business School, and she received an MBA from HBS. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy, the National Bureau of Economic Research. I will not list too many honors and awards, but one of the things that's extremely interesting in that with this academic excellence, she has over 20 years of experience in major public boards. And so really she sits at this in this unique vintage point of understanding corporations as well as research. Her own research has examined how organizations respond to large-scale technological change, and more recently focusing on energy, the environment, in particular, how the private sector can play a role in building a more sustainable economy. She co-directs the HBS Business and the Environment Initiative, and she's the author of a book that's called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, which, as you can tell from the title, is going to be very central to the discussion we plan to have today. Now, let me turn to Professor Lucie White on my left. right for you, is the Louis Horvitz Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She earned her JD from Harvard Law School and her BA from Radcliffe College. And she also received numerous awards and grants, including from Fulbright, Open Society. Something I find fascinating in Lucie's career is that after working for over 2 decades on US social welfare law and being very active in helping disadvantaged communities and groups in the US, her work turned to another part of the planet. She started understanding extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and questioning the applicability of our notions of economic and social rights. She's launched 2 pioneering initiatives at the law school. One is Making Rights Real, the Ghana Project, and this is an ongoing collaboration with Ghanaian partners and Harvard Law School students. And the other is Stones of Hope, which is a collaboration among African human rights activists and global rights scholars that are focused on innovations in economic and social rights advocacy. And this has resulted in a volume that she published in 2010 with the same title, Stones of Hope. So again, what I think is going to be, at least for me, extremely insightful, and is to see how 2 amazing intellectuals and scholars who have known very deeply the side of the corporation, the side of the institutions, including customary institutions in other parts of the world, how they've both been trying to give an answer to these issues related to growth, progress, and sustainability. So let's see. I'm gonna start with the structure for today. Will be that I try moderating this chat between Lucie and Rebecca, but then try to leave pretty much half of the session, if we can, for Q&As from you. And I'm sure this is going to be even more interesting for our guests, because you are the most interesting part of this institution, you students. So let's start just with a quick personal introduction. That's not the bio I read, but more how you come to these topics. We're here to discuss, whether growth and as an goal in our path to prosperity has some limits, which are these limits, and whether this is compatible with achieving our climate goals. But I'd love to know how you arrived at these topics, and if there was a particular moment that has shifted the way you thought about progress. So let me start by posing that question to Lucie. And I think let's see if you are, you should.
Oh, I should.
Yeah.
Great. I was thinking about that, and I'm a child of the 50s, and I grew up feeling like you got your value from having stuff. In fact, I was thinking, my mother told me that you'll never be happy, Lucie, unless you marry a millionaire. So you can get more stuff. And I think ever since then, I've questioned the role of stuff in happiness, and then increasingly the role of growth in planetary well-being.
So the moment that shifted your approach was your mother's matchmaking efforts.
That's right.
Yeah, good.
Let's see. So you're going to think this is wacky, but I have to tell you, I broke my foot a while ago, which is why I'm wearing sneakers. I've never talked professionally with sneakers before. And so I feel a bit weird. So just to let you know, I've got a bit of sneaker anxiety. So how did I become interested in degrowth and sustainability and the whole thing? Really 2 moments. One is I saw Vice President Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, on climate change, and was very moved by it. And in fact, shifted my entire research direction into sustainability, because I was like, oh, whole planet is burning. I mean, we need to do something. So I'm in the camp of why isn't everyone thinking this? But that's a kind of side conversation. And then the second moment was when I published the book you mentioned, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And it was quite successful. And forgive me, those of you who've heard this story before, but went into 7 languages. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic, so I got to do a lot of Zoom talks. I was talking to thousands of people and hundreds of rooms, and it was like, whoa, I'm successful, this is great. Book's really going to change the world. And the book was why there's an economic case for behaving better. Really quite a lot better, like, treat people with dignity and respect, give everyone reasonable wages, fix the climate crisis, you'll make money and you'll be really happy in the long term. And I thought this was a killer argument, great book, killer argument. And I thought everyone who read it would go, oh my God, Rebecca, you're completely right. I'll just do it. Well, I know. I spent the first 20 years of my research studying change in large corporations. What was I thinking? I was thinking, as many climate people did, that if you give people the information and the business case, they'll just do it. And so I got deeply, deeply interested in what I see as the fundamental moral question of our time, which is those of us who are fortunate enough to have education and enough to eat and some spare time, we know that climate change is real. And we're not doing anything. Now we're running backwards. And so that really got me interested in where does our moral framing come from? How is that embedded in our institutions? How does that guide our choices? And of course, I don't like degrowth. I don't think we should talk degrowth. I think we should talk about throwing a different party, a better party, which needs less stuff. But being in all those rooms and seeing that there was going to be no change, that really shifted me. It made me much more radical than I'd been before. And I'd been pretty radical. But now I'm really out there. Like, the whole system is problematic. The whole structure is problematic. And then that raises the question, what do you do? What do you do? Yeah.
We'll get there.
Okay.
I'd love to elaborate just a little bit more about, this idea that we've been trained to think that growth was going to solve a lot of problems. Our system is oriented towards growth. So now we know there's climate change, but kind of what went wrong? Why is it that we're so oriented towards growth, and what's wrong with it? And maybe Rebecca, given that you put this out, you can.
So I'll take a first pass. And is my sound okay? Yeah, okay. So why are we so oriented to growth? Well, let's think about this. 200 years ago, nearly everyone on the planet was living at a subsistence level. My ancestors were Scottish fishermen who were subsisting on turnips and fish. Who wouldn't want growth, right? And, it used to be that many women died in childbirth and average life expectancy was 42. And in many parts of the world, it's kind of still like that. And so why not growth? We had a dream that we could build a safe, stable, rich world, that we could make our children better off. Why not? So this wonderful sense that we can create the good life. And let's be clear, for the last 100 years, it has got a lot better. This is more your space than mine, Lucie, but my understanding is fewer women die in childbirth now than 150 years ago, not just as a percentage of the population, but in total. And, the number of people who go to bed hungry has really fallen quite dramatically. So there was a reason we oriented to growth. Now, of course, it turned out the growth generated externalities. I love that word, externality. Trash the social system, destroy the planet is just an externality. But we wrote everything to more growth, more stuff, more growth. And I can talk about the institutional architecture that embodies and encourages growth. I'd be happy to do that. But it's the way we set up the whole system, is to grow.
because we thought it would make us happy and free.
Yeah, so I'm interested, and maybe here, Lucie, you can speak based on also what you've seen in Africa. There's nothing intrinsic in growing material benefits that tells you you're going to necessarily degrade other values, right? It happened, or, there's something about even across the planet, there's various incarnations of capitalism, and I would say the US are quite an extreme here. But there's nothing that just from a theoretical point of view makes these two inconsistent. But empirically, they seem. What's your view about this?
I mean, I think that it's really important, and you, I'm sure, have a lot to say about this, but it's important to unpack what it was about the structure of the society historically that started that spiral. And I don't think I think it might be too simple to say we decided we want to make the world better. I think there was something else going on that is important to unpack, to figure, and it does go way back. It does go way back to, I think, the beginning of capitalism. It goes back to the 50s. But I think it's really important to kind of get at what happened so we can undo it.
Can you walk us through those early?
I wish I could defer to my incredible colleague, Christine Desson, who is an expert on the origins of the system of debt that developed during the early part of the capitalist era. That kind of created a dynamic that was virtually impossible to get out of. And it wasn't driven by people wanting the world to get better. People may feel like that's what they want, but the system wasn't driven by that. I think those are her conclusions, and her book certainly shows that it was and I think you've done some work in the same domain, that there was a system of debt, a system of financial institutions that set up there and that fed on kind of their own momentum so they were very hard to get out from under. And, I think that part of the reason that we don't feel agency to get out from under this is that unless you see it as a system, then I think it's hard to know how to react to it. And that's why I really, among other people, I really defer to the work you've done on capitalism.
So there is so much here, Eliana. How much? Okay.
So I have a bullet point that says proposing alternatives then. So as much as we want to diagnose it.
Let's spend just a minute with this, though, because I think it speaks to the need for alternatives.
Yeah.
So without going back to origins, where we spent a lot of time, let's talk about why right now the modern capitalist system, particularly in its extreme extractive form here in the US, is so oriented towards continual growth. And that answer is incentives. So if you're running a business, you have to make a profit in order to survive. If you don't make a profit, you don't survive. So you're always trying to do better than the other guy. It's fundamentally set up as a deep competitive system. That has and had many advantages. It's given us a lot of innovation, deep reductions in cost. I mean, there's many good things to say about the system. But what it does is it means you can never rest. You can never stay still, because someone else is going to come in and try and do the same thing better or faster. And if you're a large company and you've raised money from external investors, those investors are continually saying, but your friend across the street, he's making 6% on my money. Why should I fund you? Or 18%. Why should I fund you? You're only making 3%. And so everything is oriented. I mean, as a company, the CEO gets fired if investors believe he or she is not actively maximizing profits in every possible way. There are, of course, privately held companies that are able to survive with a more kind of balanced objective. There are companies who are so purpose-driven and authentically managed that they create superior products without having to cut every corner and run as fast as they can. But in our existing ecosystem, acting that way is at the margin. It's hard to survive that way. We could talk more about it.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Right, but the mainstream is grow, grow, grow.
Exactly.
You'll get a bigger bonus. You'll get fired if you don't. It feels exhilarating. There's a whole ideology about why growth is better. And there are still, many hungry people and lots of needs to be met. And you can tell yourself these stories about why growth is so good. So the physical mechanism, which is if you don't make your numbers, you'll be fired, is reinforced by a deep ideology about the benefits of progress and the importance of innovation. So the two things are kind of locked into each other.
That's what when I set a system, it's hard to get out of that.
Well, it's hard for many reasons. I mean, one of the byproducts of the system.
That's what I was saying, that you can't experience that or look at it and think an individual.
Well, it's not just seeing the system. I wish it was. I mean, absolutely seeing the system is the first step. But the second step is most of the money and power is controlled by a small group who are making out like bandits. And they have very little incentive to change it. So that's part of what's going on, I don't like the system so much and it has some issues, but have you seen my jet, my yacht, my status? No, and it's centralizing power, and I could talk about AI and control of social media. And so I'm agreeing with you. I'm just making it worse. I'm saying, but wait, it's worse.
No, I hear you.
It's even worse.
I get it.
So can I ask here, this is a view of the system and of the incentives that takes the supply side, right? So those who produce, the corporations and so on. There's a demand side. The goods, the services that get produced are consumed. And I believe there's part of the system we are in is also, it's kind of creating preferences and demand for certain products, for having more, for having the next model of that. And here maybe we go back to the values that get instilled already in childhood as to what constitutes success or happiness. And so this is probably goes beyond what we should talk today when we talk about ecological limits, but there might be a way of undoing this perverse system that is bottom up from the point of view of who are the consumers, and if they stop demanding certain products and they allocate their time or their resources differently, what does this do to the system? So of course, everybody looks at things from a different vantage point, but it seems that there is maybe more to be said, especially in today's world where you can reach almost every single individual pretty easily, for organizing an alternative that starts from the consumers. And if the incentives for the few super rich who produce are very hard to change. So
for sure. No, and I think Lucie wants to get in.
I just, because this is something I think about, I wonder how much consumption and the desire that you're talking about is itself produced by the system. Certainly, if you analyze the advertising industry and how the advertising industry is becoming more and more astute and connected to the big billionaires you're talking about, particularly in the age of AI. So to get to the kind of institutional innovation at, for lack of a better word, the grassroots, I don't know how you get out from under that consumption that's driven by big advertising, big industry. I don't know how you. I think about this a lot because a lot of my work has to do with these very small scale institutions and, to clear ground so people can be creative. It's very, very challenging, I find.
So I completely agree with you that the barriers to change are high, but let me try being a little more, if not optimistic, hopeful. So one of the striking things about the modern world is that those who are consuming most are not much happier than those who are consuming less.
Right, exactly.
So I didn't want to do slides because we're just having a conversation. Yeah. But we know that while life satisfaction is slightly correlated with average GDP, happiness is not.
Right.
And that even when you look at the data at the country level, there's enormous variance, right? People living in Costa Rica are way, way happier than people living in certain parts of Eastern Europe, even though the Eastern Europeans have much higher levels of material well-being measured just by money. So we know that you don't have to have enormous amounts of stuff to be happy. Now, that said, of course, we need to caveat, and I know you're going to come to that. If you're working 2 jobs, don't have adequate nutrition, don't feel physically safe, you need more material resources. But for those of us who are blessed with enough, from the data, we pretty much had enough in the 50s. And a lot of what's going on is not only appetizing, although that's important, but also status race. So who has the biggest house, who has the biggest car. The other thing that's going on is that the decentering nature, the destabilizing nature of modern capitalism, where everyone has to work really hard all the time, has really done a number on the social fabric. So that where do we look for well-being? Well, I don't have a close circle of friends. Very large numbers of people report very high levels of loneliness, low levels of intimacy. If you don't have the social support and the sense of belonging and a sense of meaning, if you're just madly trying to get by, why not get a nice bike, a holiday in Jamaica? I mean, so this is nuanced, right? The demand side is nuanced. Again, I'm just making it worse in some ways. I think the good news, if I'm going to go full on optimistic, is it's getting so bad that if we could make real the idea that there is a better way, that we could throw a better party, it's possible we might begin to see significant political and behavioral shifts. Because it's not working right now. We can throw a better party.
Yeah.
I mean, the resources are there, the technology is there. We understand a ton more about what makes humans happy and how to support them in being happy. And basically, I mean, nothing like love is the answer. Deep social bonds, deep relationality, real sense of purpose. None of this has to be incredibly expensive. And indeed, when you look at rates of happiness among Hispanic populations and Black populations, they're often much higher than you would expect from material well-being because some of the strength of social bonds is still there. So it's not impossible. It's messy, and it probably has to get worse before the political will is there. But I'm going to be a little hopeful.
You are hopeful. And I think the challenge, as you say, is to kind of decouple the consumer from the stuff. And even if people are not subjectively happy with the stuff, there's so much pressure of that connection. And that's, I mean, part of what I see is that when people can get actually involved in kind of real institutions at the grassroots that give them some of what you're talking about, they can let go a little bit of the endorphins that come with the stuff. I did a survey with my students a few weeks ago about consumption. Why do you consume, or do you consume? And it was so fascinating because many of them felt ashamed to answer it, but they confessed that they were addicted to fast fashion. Literally.
I thought you were going to say Doritos, but
fast fashion, and talked about the flood of endorphin that they got from it, not because they had any higher consciousness that made any sense, but because it was so programmed. That's why, in my experience, it sounds so dorky, but when a person can get into any kind of socially connected situation, they begin to find it possible to decouple.
I don't think it's dorky at all. I mean, let's go back to Robert Putnam's work. For those of you who don't know, everyone in here knows Robert Putnam.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So join a bowling.
Join a bowling league.
Exactly.
But I'm going to go one stage further, which is, and forgive me those of you who are taking my class at the moment, I'm pretty much full on spiritual revival, which is not just join the league, but learn to self-regulate and learn to cultivate states of wisdom and peace, which can sound like loopy, but the wisdom traditions for thousands of years have been teaching us techniques to do this. The idea that connection to the deepest part of yourself and to your deepest values is a valuable thing to have. I mean, the neurology is now all over this. So one of the problems with our current system, and now I'm generalizing horribly, okay, is that if you think there are three ways of being, one way of being is red alert. You're working all the time, you're focused, you're moving, you're doing it, you're anxious, you're afraid, you're doing it, right? I don't know about you, but I've spent enormous amounts of time in that state. It was very productive for certain kinds of things, but it really wears you out, which leads you to the black-blue state, which is, okay, I can finally stop. Oh, God. And you want to numb out. You want to just relax. This is where you go buy stuff.
Yeah.
But there's another state. There's a green state. I bet you know people in this, given where you work.
Yeah.
Where you are working with joy, with companionship, with an understanding of who you are, where your emotions are not controlling you, where you're not always reacting, where you're standing in a space of spaciousness. Now, I don't know, a couple of you are looking at me like, she has really lost it. And yeah, I have an engineering degree from MIT and a PhD in neoclassical economics from Harvard. And I'm telling you, yes, walking in nature, dancing, talking to friends, meditating regularly, whatever does it for you. We know the science of this. You can get yourself into this green state. And it's much easier to do with groups, right? So we need Putnam plus mindfulness-based stress reduction. But this is not crazy, right? The moment is desperate.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about, thank goodness, when we go to the bathrooms at Harvard, you close the door and they tell you how to go to the health center and take mindfulness courses.
Because it makes an enormous difference. They should also be directing you to local dance groups, local.
Totally true.
Yeah, no, it's just.
It's totally.
But we've created a system where we all have to be working all the time, or we feel we fall behind.
It's totally true. I mean, you may not expect us to be making pitch for Buddhism, but I totally.
Sorry, I need to come in with a bit of cultural relativism here, meaning as someone who grew up in Italy, we didn't need to be taught that you hang out with other people. That's
with
what you do, right? We don't need a course for that. We don't need stickers on the door of the bathroom. And I would say that's true. Not just Italy, but many parts of the world. We have many international students here. Here, I really do believe that the US is an outlier in the way it is deeply embedded. I was shocked the first time talking to colleagues. I realized that people were ordering in, or because this was the productive thing to do. You didn't want to waste time cooking, and so this is something where my fear is that instead of what is most common in the rest of the world coming back here and saying it can be done, it's almost the US exporting that hyper productivity and slow dissolution of the social fabric in other parts of the world. My trips, when I visited the Philippines and started seeing these malls and people gathering in the malls, and now life happens in the mall, I was horrified. And part of me thought, this is great that they're the material well-being is going up, but why does it need to happen with the mall becoming the next institution? Yeah. And so I don't think I understand why, if once you see that doesn't bring you the level of satisfaction and well-being, why does that, from an evolutionary even perspective, that model get reproduced so fast, so quickly?
I hate to be cynical, but there is a humongous mall in Accra now, and when I bring students there, all they want to do is go to the mall, and the Ghanaian students meet them there. The mall is big money, and it's international big money. It's not, and the big multinational consumer goods are shipped through there. It's not an accident that there's a mall in Ghana. Some people resist it. We can talk about that or not. But, it gets planted there.
But sure, the big money wants to plant a mall.
Yeah.
But if people are so happy hanging out with family and friends, why do they go to the mall? Maybe there's something that's too simplistic into these, social relationships are going to replace, because otherwise they wouldn't embrace it so much. They have the social relationship to start with.
Partly it's the dynamic of the system, which is you don't imagine that when you first buy a television and turn it on, I'm dating myself, but I remember the first televisions, you don't imagine that's going to break down the family relationship. When you go to the mall and buy some pretty clothes, because why not? That's a pleasure. It's an immediate pleasure, and humans like pleasure. You don't think, well, this is going to drastically undermine the fabric of our society. It takes time, and humans are super not good at slow, bad side effects, right? Do you exercise every day? You probably do. But we know.
I know I have some students and colleagues.
We know absolutely exercise every day, no excuse, absolutely the thing to make you happy and trim and long life. And how many of us do it? Because it's so much easier to stay home and watch Netflix reruns. So this is why you need to develop the inner discipline, because sometimes inner discipline is as simple as, I really, really want to eat the chocolate bar. Last time I ate the chocolate bar, I remember that. I felt awful. But it's really about mental discipline. And then, as Lucie says, understanding the dynamics of the system. So you need groups of Italians or groups of Ghanaians to come together and say, not here, not here. But that's hard, because then the mall plays off the relevant people.
And I think also it's very easy to idealize the kind of social connection somewhere else.
The social connection can be a pain in the butt.
It can be.
This is something we should really talk about.
And that's part of why
these family dinners. My mother's Italian. Not all the family dinners are a great time.
That's as true in You know, in
upon
Ghana,
myself.
people want to get out of the house, get the hell out of the house.
I'm gonna unravel and
drop on track.
No. Actually, given that you mentioned this, let's jump to this thing, Lucie, with the work you did with the grassroots in Ghana.
Yeah.
And what did you see in terms of this bottom up building of institutions, the values, and so? What from that experience can speak to what we're discussing?
It's so analogous. I mean, a lot of hard work at the local level in lots of different institutional settings. People working hard in rural areas to create some commonality in co-ops raising cocoa. People working in urban areas trying to do co-housing that they've learned from, I don't know where, the TV or something. People trying to have yoga classes. I mean, it's a pushing back against the mall, actually, and trying to draw from, in many ways, idealized versions of the deep roots that they have. I mean, there's still part of that. There's a lot of work around cultural institutions, music, their whole network of little restaurants in Accra that have local music. I mean, but it's not like, some old authentic stuff just happened to live forever. It's people working hard to recreate and maintain and create settings that would push back against the mall. Literally. The one thing that is interesting is the work. So I did several years of work around oil and the discovery of oil and the debates about whether it should be capped or pumped and whatnot. And there were people trying to get a handle around alternatives to extraction before both oil in particular, they didn't have a choice with gold, but whether there was some path other than extraction with respect to the oil. And that was an interesting conversation because it engaged the poverty, and when there was some way of living that was a good life without the consumption or the development of the extraction, and that direction we've been talking about. That didn't get very far, but there were people, and still are people, who are really struggling in their own minds and institutions to figure out if there's an alternative to oil extraction.
So let me actually, from here, thinking about, we started with these implications, not only for our own happiness, but also for the planet and climate. And so I'd love to talk about what's feasible and what alternatives we have on the table. And I know, Lucie, you said, let's not talk about degrowth. And I would be curious in the sense that, and I'm not a fan of that either, but it seems that some of what we're discussing in practice, which is scaling back material consumption, replacing it with something else, is maybe a version, not the fully fledged theory, might be a version of that. The other version might be the kind of green growth and say you don't need to sacrifice anything when it comes. You can keep consuming more and decouple, and then you save the planet that way. Or this third set of post-growth models, some of which originate in the South. So these are some of the alternatives that are discussed. What's your assessment of those, and why do you like or dislike some, and what would be the feasible path forward if you were to propose something in terms of policy making?
So first, I think the idea that we can decouple is really mistaken. It is true that both the UK and I believe Denmark are now consuming less stuff for higher GDP, but it's at a level of consumption that it's very hard to see that you could generalize that to the whole world. So I do think the adjustment will require real changes in how we live. But there's good news. It doesn't mean that we have to live in huts and eat turnips. I mean, there's a lot of technology. I don't know if you've seen Bill McKibben's new book, Here Comes the Sun. What's happening to the price of renewables is astounding. So, and if you look at the work of Julius Steinberger, who is based in Switzerland, we can provide a very good standard of living with decent housing, decent healthcare, real education, enough nutrition at a 1960s level of energy consumption, which we could generate through renewables. So you can make the numbers add up, but it doesn't look like today's high energy, high consumption lifestyle that a few of us in the West are privileged to lead. So not decoupling, but yes, accepting lower levels of consumption. And there are really three ways in which those of us who have all the stuff might be persuaded to use less. Yeah. One is the obvious one, which is we are forced to. I think the climate crisis is of significant magnitude, that we should expect to see major breakdowns in the food, energy, transportation sectors in the next 10 to 20 years, particularly if the world remains at war, soaking up much of the spare resources. So the bad news is that will feel very uncomfortable. The good news is that is a reset, right? So one of the things that happened in World War II is most of the existing capital was destroyed, which really reduced inequality and created much higher levels of social cohesion. So one way to think about what's happening is getting ready for these rolling disasters and what are the ways forward. Because we have the technology to do amazing things. I mean, to build small houses, incredibly energy efficient, to grow food in much more effective ways. And if we could combine this with the kind of small-scale local community rediscovery that you've been talking about, and the rules to keep in check the people that will have temptations to push in other directions. So I'm thinking of a much stronger regulatory state and very high taxation for people at high levels of income. And of course, all of this assumes a political movement that could sustain it. But if your question is there a solution we could move to? I think there's absolutely a solution we could move to. It would be much better for many of the people on the planet. And we haven't talked about this, much better for much of the natural world. You know, simple things like no more beef, right? Huge effect on natural environments, on the carbon profile, on health. But again, the politics of no more beef are tricky and much easier when no one has beef and you don't get the opportunity to start eating it again. So am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think you are. I mean, I was with you when you were like, you know, the catastrophe could have a silver lining. I think when you say more regulation, taxation at the top, I see that the beauty of that solution, but whether it's going to happen, it seems we're going further and further.
You didn't ask me the transition question. You asked me the end goal question.
Okay, fair enough.
The reason taxation at the top is so important is you try and constrain this racing ever upwards.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if everybody understands there's some level at which taxation becomes confiscatory, which many societies used to do, like it was 90% when you get over a certain income level, because the inequality is so corrosive in so many ways. How you get there, some combination of multiple low-level crashes, the rebuilding of local society, a new understanding of what politics could be. Yeah, now I'm...
Yeah, that's what makes me skeptical is that the new technologies are even more concentrated into the hands of those people who would get the 90%. And so I don't see them holding control of the technology and allowing for this type of institutional reform.
We are in a really terrible place.
Yeah,
that's the
be there.
But that doesn't mean you don't think about how to fix it.
Just a couple of briefly things to add to that. To envision any of this, you would have to have a very, not generous necessarily, but a comfortable social welfare, set of social welfare institutions, housing that people would want to live in because it's so communal, food that they'd want to eat, etc. And you would have to have that transfer of wealth to have that. But,
imagine publicly owned AI and social media that's geared to supporting connection and adult development.
Absolutely.
AI that really is used as a complement to labor so the economy becomes much more productive. I don't think we should be too doomy. Lots of people are really uncomfortable with the current setup.
Oh, I think it's true.
Yeah. I can do the doom and gloom like that, but that's the easy thing. Despair is easy. Easy. That's not the goal of your life. We have to work our way through this. Yeah. That's the thing.
Yeah.
We're trained to be analytic and say why it won't work, and that's easy. Much harder. Like why? Sorry, I went.
No. It's great. What's publicly owned AI? Is it government owned, or it's a myriad of shareholders that?
I think there are many possible structures. We could, if we were sure the democracy was really strong, and as you may know, the work by Audrey Tang and Glenn Weil in Plurality, looking at how IT can really be used to put democracy in the service of the population. There's some really exciting work how you redo democracy. And AI could be either publicly owned by the government if we trusted the government, or you could have it owned at a local level, or you could put the core technology in the public domain and have everybody build their own AI, or you could have all the big things owned by citizens. Or you could a wonderful piece called The Citizen Share.
Many of those things.
Right. Or you could do all different kinds of
versions. I think when we're envisioning that, just infusing it all with democracy at every level.
Of course.
And there's been a lot of talk about how to democratize production and the distribution of capital. That's
lots of interesting ideas.
Yeah,
it could definitely be done.
So you can really just
and lots of examples. We must say this is not just some random fable that we're making up. There are organizations and places operating this way right now.
And you could do the same thing with social provision, social welfare. It wouldn't have to be bureaucratic and top down. It could be.
Although you have to share risk across a large enough risk pool.
Yes.
So there's something to be said for large effective states.
I'm not saying you shouldn't have states. I'm not saying you should.
But you could do it in ways that create community rather than create division. Yes.
Yeah.
So I would love to continue, but I promised I was going to leave room.
I know.
Okay. We just close it without...
we're all hopeful.
Here's something, you probably already thought of this, but how about getting 3 questions?
Yeah.
All at the same time.
Very good.
And then we can... Lisa and I can.
Yes, let's do that.
We want to ask.
Okay, so we need multiples of 3 arriving fast. Great. And unmute the mic and
hello. My question was related to when you were sharing about your experiences with your book, where you thought that giving the people the business case and the information would be enough, and we found that it wasn't necessarily the case. So if giving complete information or giving the incentives is not enough, then what do you think is the viable channel to be able to change ideas? Is it shaping narratives? Is it crafting some sort of I don't want to use advertising, but advertising campaign? And where do you think are the mediums or platforms where such a change-making initiative would be effective?
So I have sort of a high-level question. Something I always find myself coming back to as a trite lesson is being able to accept multiple truths. So like, for example, something we've discussed here in this conversation is the way that capitalism and industrialization has brought material well-being and innovation, but also has led to exploitation of land and human beings. And so in internalizing that, I feel like through grad school, I've also accepted a very pragmatic way of like how change can be sort of progressed, and believing that like those pragmatic small changes is durable. But I feel like today we've kind of discussed a bit more like radical, widespread system change. So I was curious to hear your perspectives on how you balance pragmatism versus like more radicalism or idealism, and like how do you know when to advocate for smaller, slower, tractable changes versus sort of more bigger, sweeping, sort of like change everything type changes.
Thank you for this very interesting debate. I was thinking about something we saw at Mitter's class about China that was interesting. We were talking about the guerrillas in communist China and what was their strategies. Basically, it was about military disputes and advances when Japan was being imperialistic around China, and the Chinese communist arm found this way of battling, which was basically we're battling against something that is so big, so impossible to win. It's weird to think of, but yeah, Japan was so much more relevant militarily than China that it was just impossible that China would ever win. So they just flipped the logic. They went all the way to rural communities. They went with ideas. They didn't go necessarily only with guns. So anyways, I think there's some sort of romanticism around it. Of course, it was also a very violent strategy. It included starvation. It was many bad aspects to it. But I was just trying to think of the parallels of this feeling of we are here talking, want it or not. I feel like a great part of the debate that we're having is actually kind of old in the sense that right now, Anthropic is sending reports about all the jobs that will exist very soon. So like 80% of analytical and business jobs will be disappearing. And how, like, probably if people graduating like us within 2 years will have a very hard time finding jobs for like analytical stuff. So want it or not, it's almost like we have such a bigger challenge in front of us that I was just thinking, like, should we just go guerrilla in some way? Like, how can we divert the logic of how we operate? Because right now it feels like, am I going to be like a climate person discussing, oh, the energy consumption of data centers is so high and the communities are getting no water? And it just always feels like we're like with ice becoming water in our hands so fast. So is there any way that we can flip the logic and the dynamic so that we can feel we're having some air to breathe and be with the upper hand in some level of this discussion? This is, I'm not even sure if this question makes sense. And I hope this recording doesn't go too far.
The guerrilla part, especially. Okay. No. Okay. So please take it in the order in which you want to go first.
Finn, I feel like the thread that I hear, and I'm not sure how it translates, is pragmatism. I mean, no matter how daunting the situation, somehow putting one foot in front of the other and trying to, this comes back to the Buddhism, I guess, just kind of feeling where you are and trying to be creative about the next step. And, I certainly think about that when I'm trying to imagine, or engage in what's the little niche in which a institution can be built where people can come together and do something that they'll makes them feel better. You just want to be pragmatic and be real and be creative and just hope that the ice doesn't turn to water too fast. I mean, but that's what I would.
I think it's interesting how all three questions are variants of the same question. So let me try a couple of answers. One is this distinction between incremental or radical change and how fast. I think what we know about most major changes is there are sort of 3 stages. One is fixing up the current system. The second is trying new things that might get us somewhere really different. And the third is really trying out those really different things. One way this is sometimes described in the change literature is horizon 1, 2, and 3. So horizon 3 is like the really crazy different stuff. Let's get it out there. Let's make it an example. Let's do that. To your question, one way to change business and how we think about it is some of those examples that are out there. And so I spent many years of my career finding those examples, writing about them, showing how they made money, and everybody was more, happier and doing different kinds of things. And for a while, until this recent massive backlash, just the existence of those organizations and talking about them was beginning to get other people interested. So you can work at H3. What will it really look like? What would be different? H2 is what are the incremental things we can do to really try and shift? Can we tell a different story? Can we manage organizations differently? Are there small changes you can do? And there are lots of people working in that space, right? So all the organizational consultants, all the strategy people, let's try the intermediate thing. And that's super important, right? Because there's no way to jump everyone to that third horizon. This question about the gorillas and should we just reimagine something completely different? I think the answer is completely yes. My own variant of that is indeed this crazy. Learn to regulate yourself. Build a community around you that you trust. Make sure you have sources of joy. That's like radically countercultural. I mean, Mark Andreessen, and now, have you seen this clip? He's saying, I never introspect. And, people saying, oh, you don't want to do that empathy thing. You can get like toxic empathy. You can get empathetic with your enemies. So this is the jujitsu move. This is the jujitsu move that the civil rights revolution is very complicated and multifaceted. But one of the things they did is find a way to fight that was a very different way. And I think that's part of what we need to do. But you have to hold both sides, right? So you try the crazy stuff, but you're also thinking about the next step and the pragmatic step and showing that it could work. And of course, that could be in a whole group. Like, not everybody has to do everything. That's a partial answer. Yeah, so a new narrative, a new way of thinking about being, a new goal to work towards, and beginning to enact that, both personally and in organizations and institutions. We can run schools completely differently. The research is there. We can run accounting and finance completely differently. We know how to do that. Let's have the examples. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
Absolutely not. So I see 3 questions on this side, Nicole, and then we go back.
I actually want to ask a follow-up question to exactly what you just said, where in a policy school with presumably people who will go to enact policy in the future, but yet where like our core economics classes and business classes are still based on this system that's no longer working, that we keep talking about, that needs to change. Why aren't we learning these alternative visions of the world or these alternative ways that the economy should be run as part of our core curriculum? Why does it have to be a niche class that we need to seek out?
Is that a question to me, Nicole?
Right.
I'm sure she means it in a constructive, helpful, appreciative way.
My question is related to what you said about how social capital is a driver of happiness, and today the Consumption Act says a signal for your social status, but also the group you're part of and your social belonging, basically. And so it seems that status, to take status for instance, is like a driver of growth, both on the producer side, but also on the consumer side, because that's, like consumption is a way to signal status. So if you produce more, you make more money, and then you gain more status. But also if you consume more, then you're able to have that signal that you belong to a group and have a high status. So I was just like curious to see how realistic it is to move to like a low growth model, and if that's a stable equilibrium, since that humans, it seems that for the history of mankind have been like that's been one belonging and status have been such deep rooted social norms and drivers and yeah, for everything that humans do. I'm like, what would realistically replace that in a low growth model?
Rebecca, this is, I mean, to your point of being optimistic, and I might be a little fanciful here, but imagine a world where everything is agentic and we've somehow figured out how to share the profits among everybody. And let's assume that people have a lot of free time in their hands. So to your book, like Reimagining Capitalism, how do you think capitalism will look like in that model? Like, what sort of economy will there be? An economy? How will that, like, what will people do is pretty much my question.
These are fabulous questions.
Told you that was the most interesting part. I should have shut up, half an
You
hour
should
ago.
have shut us up.
Half an hour ago. But
wow. So let me take some quick responses. Why are so many courses exactly the same course that they were 10 years ago? Why are so many senior people walking around seemingly not realizing that things are becoming unstuck, even when like everything is flashing, right? So yes, we won't talk about what's happening right now, but I'm sorry. I'm married to a political scientist. Breakfast conversations are really tough. Why is that? Well, alas, I know. I spent 20 years studying denial. I worked with Nokia. Has anyone in here heard of Nokia? At the time, they were the leading cell phone company in the world, a third of this Finnish stock exchange. They were shipping 1 million cell phones a week. Because when you are benefiting from the system, when it's working really well for you, and doing something different means a major loss in status or power, it's very hard to make that shift. So the most successful people, nations, companies are always the last to shift. It's just threatening as heck. It's deeply scary. It's like, if I don't teach this, what am I going to teach? I spent my whole life learning to do this, and now you want me to do what? And it's kind of working, isn't it? Kind of working. So that's what we're seeing. It will unravel. Typically, it unravels very quickly when it starts to unravel. And in the meantime, so yes, in the kind of course I'm teaching is a Horizon 3 course. Like, you could do this. And so that's really important work. But it's so important to, I sound like a Hallmark greeting card, to hold people with love when they're in that place. Because if you just say, well, you're old and stupid and not getting the point, people react super badly. That's what I also learned from 20 years of research. You have to hold it and make a pathway and help them move. On the question of status and consumption and what would status look like in a no-growth society, so it's not true that humans have always been high accumulation, high status. For approximately 180,000 years, it was small bands moving. What we know about those bands, which we are deducing from people who've studied the remnants, is that those bands spend a lot of time trying to quench status competition. So, for example, among the Bushmen in the Kalahari, if someone goes out and catches a giraffe and is a super good giraffe hunter, someone who's nodding has read this book too, when they come back into the camp, everyone goes, oh, you think you're so great. I mean, like, you're young and strong. Like, get over yourself. So there are strong social mechanisms. And the other way to do it, of course, is multiple sources of status competition, including dance and music, but it can be socially constructed, so status is about not stuff. And humans have done that many, many times, so we could do that. On the, your question, what does capitalism look like when we live in a world of abundance and the machines give us everything? Well, if you're imagining that, I can imagine that we all have, from a very young age, trained in group relationality, in self-regulation, in understanding that the true roots of happiness lie in service, in generosity, in building things together, in building exciting projects. And in that economy, the machines run the food and the housing. And what we do is we create. We basically do games. We do games, we do music, we do sports, we do all these things. And sometimes we build firms because it's fun and we change the machines. But it's a world that looks like play and connection. And do you know this phrase? We face a really, really urgent 100-year project. It's at least 100 years, but why not? Why not? Yeah.
You know, two words that you say that I think are so important is pathway and holding. No, we need to be holding each other more as we find new pathways and whatever they might be.
So I'd love to hear your answer to the status question, because my experience, at least in some parts of African communities, is that is really strong, but not necessarily in a good way. This idea of the tall poppy, if somebody suddenly emerges, there's very destructive actions that can be taken, and the substitute for the status coming from wealth or productivity in some cases is simply seniority, age or status in the social hierarchy. I don't see a paradise or a utopian society there either. What is it that you see as, replacing status based on your grassroots work that could be positive and not?
Well, the one thing you said, which is so true, is that the status quo is by no means utopian. And I think a first step is to recognize that and not to expect it to be. And then just as, we're doing everywhere and they're doing, that are people who are trying to change, it is to find the best of what has been and carry that forward. So there's a lot of imagining of what the past might have been, a lot of Afrofeminism, for instance, that is trying to reimagine a past that never was, in order to bring it forward in these small institutions I was talking about. But absolutely not closing your eyes to the status that's there and has been there.
Could I answer your really beautiful question? Because it's a great question, right? And it's very easy to fantasize about communal life, and we all live in a cooperative house, and we come together and we share ideas and we cook meals and we cooperatively raise our children. And I've lived in cooperative houses and they're great, but they're not like that. And the single capacity, it's interesting. The single capacity we need to go forward is the ability to co-regulate. And to do that means to be able to fight, to disagree, to fundamentally work with someone you really dislike and understand their point of view and talk through what that means and come to some resolution. It's easy to fantasize about indigenous life, right? But what was one of the central institutions of many successful indigenous societies was the circle. And you sit in circle all day and you talk about what's going wrong and how you can fix it. And it's work to do that. It's really work to maintain social harmony. So we're back to our Italian families, right? You stay in the family because it's much better than being alone in the apartment with your takeout, even if in the short term that feels like a refuge and a safe space. You have to work it. And that's why, I sit in this classroom, I talk about inner work, and to me, part of me, it sounds berserk. But this is not berserk. The idea that we thought we could run a whole society not worrying about our inner states or our emotional self-regulation or our ability to talk to other people, that was berserk. That was really crazy.
And so, yes, really learning those skills is going to be core, I think, because ain't no utopia. You're entirely right.
So we'll give the mic back there, or if it's really a two-finger question on this, because there's people who haven't talked.
Just a point on this. I just to the status. I just want to get something from my context. So, ancient Hinduism before colonization, the highest status was actually given to people on the highest tier of the Maslow's hierarchy. So, essentially, not the status, not shelter, not safety, not self-esteem, but actually self-actualization. So, the roots of Buddhism again is from India. So the highest status was given to people, not to people who consume, but to people who are so rooted in themselves that they were considered almost godlike.
And again, I generalize horribly, but someone like the Dalai Lama doesn't get self-realized to get status. He self-realizes because he doesn't need status. That's another thing the inner work can do. Is one of the signs of spiritual growth is you don't have to play that game anymore. So that's another way to think about it. It's a beautiful comment.
I need to say something. It's not a question, but I want to put it out there. I'm thinking of the person who's working 2 jobs and not being able to pay rent, utilities, put food on the table, and us going there and say, meditate and find out. I cannot see that happen. But
I want to speak to this. This is a very common reaction when I start talking about inner work. People say, well, that's for privilege. But no, it's not. The people marching with Martin Luther King, they were working 2 jobs. They had trouble putting food on the table. Why were they marching? Why were they together? Because they went to church together, because they prayed together. The idea that inner life, it doesn't mean, you have to do expensive yoga classes. It means being open to the wisdom traditions or whatever works for you. That is not a sign of privilege. And in fact, many of the more disadvantaged societies are much more attuned to inner work than we are. So I think be careful with that one, right? Be careful. No, I'm not going to.
I feel like I'm the voice of despair, but there are a lot of chaotic situations among the people you describe who are not.
It would be very unskillful to show up and say what you need to do is yoga classes.
Yeah.
I'm completely with you.
That's what I'm saying.
But not as unskillful, perhaps, to say maybe you want to try one of the apps and breathing regularly, or
No way.
Okay, great. Let's take no. Let's take 3 questions. One, Parinit, and then and I'll come later to you.
So I am also for inner work, and I see the other point, but I actually have not given up on policy. And I'm curious, because I'm somewhat familiar with your work, Rebecca. What have you given up on financial sector reform? You touched on it briefly, but things like bringing in the pension funds and other kind of, how do you feel about that
Absolutely not. Absolutely. The H2 work, the intermediate work, when I said we know the accounting, we know the finance, that work is super important as well. And in talking about the more long-term, more inner work, I do not mean to denigrate those intermediate solutions. I have come to believe that until we do that harder inner work, we won't do the intermediate solutions. So that it's a both and. It's a both and.
I think
Sorry, I broke the rule.
So my question would probably be differently worded based on the status question, but I was thinking about the situation we had about like going to malls, and really to me it's about what incentives exist, which is to say that when you go to a mall, it's because you aspire for something which is drilled down to you as the better life, right? And that's why like every individual acts for their best interest, right? So when we look to change the narrative, what incentive are we providing for individuals that this is in your best interest? Because I do see like a strong effort in terms of like lobbying, right? Which is to consume more is in your best interest. But where do we then see, who do we see as taking the lead on this shift in narrative, and what incentives can we offer people to create this change?
I mean,
questions there.
Yeah, sorry.
Collect 3 and then I repeat the other. Yes.
Yes, I guess I was going to ask a version of the question that was already sort of asked, is just trying to make this distinction between culture and policy a little bit explicit, and what is the role of each in getting us into this mess, and then maybe getting us out of it. But since that question was already sort of asked, I was hoping to sneak in another one, which is just that World Happiness Report was published last week, and a lot of the countries in the top 10, Finland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, there's an argument that these are highly capitalist societies with a lot of stuff. So I wonder if you think this presents any kind of a challenge to what we've been discussing.
So I want to ask something related to, like, we're talking about growth and ecology today, and we also touched upon AI and AI acting as like sort of seeing the silver lining in it being a complement to labor. But AI requires a lot of energy and water and resources, and a lot of these are extracted from the global south. So how do you sort of convince people in the global south that AI can be used as a tool for human flourishing when they're the ones being impacted by it in the worst ways?
Lucie, do you want to go first? I think.
I would, to both of these first questions, incentives and culture policy, I keep coming back to the same theme. I don't really think about institutions when I think small scale. I think much more about design, and I think about a synergy among the individuals, the humans who are engaging in that design and being in that design and interacting with it, because I think it's through that internal change and external change happens. And I'm speaking very literally. It can be a classroom, that's designed differently, or a circle that's designed differently. And I feel like that's where change starts to happen. And it's a question of finding opportunities for those kinds of settings to happen. We should be having conversation with folks at the design school when we want to think about policy.
So I want to start my answer with the World Happiness Report. The World Happiness Report mostly concentrates on life satisfaction, which is a very dangerous metric. It says roughly how well do you think you're doing in life. And there's some evidence that it triggers a consumption orientation. And the question is read as, do you have a nice house? And that's one reason it's correlated with income. If you look at the Global Flourishing Project and the work of Taylor Vanderweel at the Harvard School of Public Health, he uses 8 separate measures of human flourishing, 2 of which are relational, 2 of which are material, 2 of which are individual. I forget what the other 2 are. I have it here. And when you do that metric, those 8 metrics, and you do it across countries and over time, Indonesia is at the top. Nigeria and Egypt are significantly in advance of the US and the UK. The UK is like way at the bottom. Super interesting. So one of the things is, what do we measure? How do we define human flourishing? So I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's Tyler Vanderweel, VANDERWEELE, the Center for Human Flourishing. Just very, very interesting work. The question on culture and policy, which I don't think we've talked enough about, of course they're interactive with each other. How many of you read Political Emotions by Martha Nussbaum? That's one of my go-to books. It really says, if you just think policy, you lose what makes the basis of a functioning society, which is love for the polity, love for the community. And then to your question, Carlos, it starts to talk about how you create that. Like, what kinds of narratives, how do you build commitment to the common flourishing? And what she hasn't done, because she wrote it 15 years ago, is think about how you would translate that into modern media. But I think there are lots of ideas about how you would create that kind of narrative and what it would look like. And to the question about how do you get incentives for people to shift, this is the have a better party. Lots of people right now are miserable, like really unhappy. I mean, you know, rates of mental health, rates of suicide. South Korea, one of the most successful material countries, very high suicide rate. It really is more fun to have more friends and be more inner directed and to run less hard.
And the issue is it's like when you first start to work out, it doesn't feel good at all. So there's a transition period, which gets back to the cultural issue and the policy issue, which is how do we build cultures and policies that support people in moving towards human flourishing? I mean, Italy has this amazing culture that supports. I mean, in it, my understanding, I've only spent a bit of time there, is if I turn into a frantic workaholic and work all the time, and I'll get a lot of cultural pressure to stop doing that. So how do we kind of rebuild those kind of cultures? Last on AI and tool for flourishing, too hard a question. Like, if it were me, a single AI system, publicly owned, don't roll it out so fast. One of the things that's driving energy use is they're all competing with each other. So the really strong competitive mechanism is clicking in. And I have had a life of studying innovation and technical change. They're rolling out very early models, which means they're super energy expensive. Probably the costs will come way, way down. Almost certainly the costs will come way, way down. Because this is, it's moving so fast that they're not starting to see the benefits of growth and innovation. Yeah. Oh, what great questions.
At time. I don't know if there's someone who wants to close with a question.
I don't know if I could close, but I still have questions, right? So one is on the theory of change, right? So from what I understand and leave with is that this might be more demand driven than supply driven, is that we rely more on people to change and transform within and then hope those changes reflect in the choices they make and change the incentive structure. And like, one, is that a correct reading, or is there more to this than what you're proposing? And then I think second is more a comment which might lead up to a question is, in a lot of these, I mean, a lot of literature and institutions that we've spoken about, a lot of them still tend to be represented by the more capitalized part of the world, right? I mean, we still haven't heard about this being spoken more about in the areas that we are looking to emulate, right? Say probably more European, more Asian cultures where this is an intrinsic part of how people live there, right? So is it also a question of vocabulary in the representation? So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a question starting as a comment, but yeah.
Okay.
And sorry, I would ask maybe to whoever wants to answer this, but also just give us your parting thoughts for us.
So it's the
from
same
this session.
thing. Okay. Theory of change. I think things will get sufficiently bad that there will be enormous demand for different institutional arrangements and experimentations with them. I continue to hope that as things get worse, significant segments of the elite will shift the supply. When I look at examples of major social change, having the elite split is really helpful. So Reimagining Capitalism was designed as one of an elite splitting books. It's like, no, this is a stupid way to run the railroad, really move. To your second question, I think what you're hearing is white European bias. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure if we had, there are amazing thinkers in the Global South who could have very different perspectives, and I'd love to hear from them.
Okay. So what I love from these sessions is that I really come very, recharged with thoughts and willingness to change and so on. We need to find a way to keep it up. If not embed it in the core micro-macro sequence, but I think it's important. And I'm talking Harvard as an institution, not necessarily HKS. We have 3 schools represented.
No, there are
here.
few of us across the university, and we're not meeting with each other.
We should ease right into a yoga class.
Yeah. Next time, bring your,
I'm more a Tai Chi person, but yes.
Okay, cool. So I want to just thank Lucie and Rebecca for very generously sharing their time and giving us so much to think about. And please keep doing the amazing work you've been doing.
Eliana, I would like to thank you for being a wonderful host and leading a really interesting conversation.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
for putting it all together.